What we talk about is the Pledge of Allegiance test. Okay, if you're going fast enough that you can't get through a whole line without taking a breath, so you're like, I pledge allegiance to, you're going too fast, right? If you're going just about the right speed, where you can get through a line before you have to take a breath, you're going about the right speed, and that's all it takes. I mean, when you do that 3 or 4 times a week, like you look at the numbers, that reduces the risk of death from everything, from heart disease to cancer, by about 50%. There's no pill I can give you that does that.
Hi, welcome to Inside Science Conversations. I'm Chris Gorski, the senior editor at Inside Science, a website produced by the American Institute of Physics. I studied geology in college, worked then science filmmaking in graduate school before working in cable television and coming to AIP to work on a science news video program. Soon after I got here, I started writing news stories, and I was hooked. I was given the privilege to talk to scientists about, really fantastic discoveries and new thought, and got to break my brain over and over again. But something was missing, and it was a chance to figure out who these people are and why they do what they do. And that's what this show is about. For our first episode, we have Dr. Phil Skiba joining us. He works in sports medicine with 2 Chicago area hospital systems. He's been a coach who's worked with top athletes. He's also worked at the front lines fighting the coronavirus, and more recently with athletes who are trying to recover from long COVID. Phil, welcome to Inside Science Conversations.
Well, thanks for having me.
Looking forward to talking to you. As a doctor and a sports physiologist, a general expert on these things, it's really exciting to get a chance to talk to you. So just wanted to kind of ask, when you were like 10 or 12 years old, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
I was going to be an astronaut.
Wow. Okay. How long did you go for that?
I mean, for a good long time. The main challenge was that I'm both too tall to fly fighter aircraft and too blind. So in the late 80s, early 90s, I was told in no uncertain terms that this future was not for me. Um, and in fact, just a couple years ago, I applied again to the space program, and it turns out I'm also too tall for a spacesuit. You got to be under 6'3". So this was not for me.
That's funny. I remember having a little bit of that experience as well, where they were like, we do need you to have a certain kind of vision. And I just went, oh, deflated. So was the doctor the next thing, or was there something else?
No, I mean, I always liked science. It was really growing up, it was kind of my thing. But as I got through my education, it's funny. I ended up not thinking I was particularly good at math because I didn't have any particularly good teachers until I was really a senior in high school. Um, and I had a great pre-calculus teacher, and all of a sudden the penny kind of dropped. So I went away to college and as a biology major, and I started taking things like physics and calculus, and I was, I was crushing them, and my grades were getting sent home, and my father was looking at me like, because my father's really a talented mathematician, and he was like, "Who are you? What did you do with my son?" kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's kind of the problem, right? Is that a lot of things in American education are taught by memorization, and that's not how I work. I have to understand something, and so my pre-calc teacher taught things in terms of physics. Here's a problem: you've got this bowling ball you're going to drop off the roof, and how are you going to figure out how long it takes to get to the ground? And when you put it in those terms, oh, that's easy to figure out. Versus giving me a bunch of things I'm supposed to memorize, that wasn't for me.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Teachers make all the difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you had math going, and then you also had an interest in medicine?
Yeah, when I first came out of college, I actually started out. I come from a family of dentists, and so when I first got out of college, I went into a program in New Jersey where I would get my dental degree and my PhD in microbiology. And it took me just a few months to realize that dentistry really wasn't for me. So I began working towards my PhD, and then within just about a year of getting started, I had a cancer scare, and so I had to go through this process of surgery and meeting all these doctors and stuff. And I very quickly realized that there's a lot of really just crummy doctors in the world. And I was like, I can do this better. And so I applied to medical school, which maybe not surprisingly didn't go particularly well at first because I'm going on these interviews and these guys are saying to me, you went to dental school and you didn't like that, and you're leaving your PhD program. How do we know if we let you into medical school, that you're gonna stay? And I was like, well, it's kind of this or the priesthood at this point. So, give me a break. And, no one thought that was particularly funny. So I was just getting waitlisted at a lot of places, and I'm thinking, oh man, I'm in trouble. And then I had the very good fortune. I interviewed in medical school in Missouri, and I was being interviewed by this guy named Max Gutenson, who was the dean emeritus of the school. And he was older than dirt at the time. I mean, I think he was in his mid 80s at least. So he's adjusting his hearing aids, and he asked me the one question no one had asked, which was, when did you first think about medicine as a career? So I told him my granddad was Charlie Mayo of the Mayo Clinic's surgical tech during World War II in the South Pacific. And so I said, I'd heard these incredible stories about operating with Dr. Mayo and all these kinds of things. And Dr. Gutenson's eyes like light up, and he was from Minnesota. He goes, Charlie Mayo. He goes, I knew Charlie Mayo. He was a hell of a guy. Your granddad worked for him. You're working for me. You're coming to Missouri. And I'm like, no fooling, right? And so, so I leave the day at the end of my interview, and I get this phone call at the hotel just like an hour later. And they said, Mr. Skiba, Dr. Gutenson's not taking no for an answer. If we gave you the papers, would you just sign today? And that's how I got into medical school.
Holy moly, that's something else.
Yeah, it's pretty surreal when you think about
it. Was he your kind of advisor through things, or was that?
In the beginning, he was a little bit of a mentor, because because he always wanted to kind of check up on me, and see how I was doing. And he gave me a lot of, just he was so old, he really wasn't practicing medicine anymore, but he would still do social rounds at the hospital and visit patients and stuff because he knew everybody in town. But one of the most important pieces of advice he ever gave me, he said, Dr. Skiba, in the first 2 minutes you meet a patient, you have two important decisions to make, and they're going to guide the rest of your treatment plan. Is the patient sick or not sick? And is the patient crazy or not crazy? Which is a little bit of, he was a country boy, so it was a little bit of a harsh way of putting it. But it's true in a way, because, people often look at mental health and physical health as though they're separate things when they're really dimensions of the same thing. And so if you're dealing with someone who both has some physical illness and has some element of mental illness and cannot necessarily relate to you, exactly what's going on with them, or they can't be a good historian, you've really got your work cut out for you. And so he taught me from very early on that you have to kind of learn how to meet the patient where they are right away. Otherwise, things are not going to go well for them.
Well, are those first impressions something that, is that a skill that you develop, or is that something that you have to figure out when you've been wrong, or how do you get into that part of things?
It's an interesting challenge, because I think there are people in the world who are just good at reading other people. And I think I am. But there are definitely times when I've been fooled or led down the wrong path, or something like that. I can remember one case where I had a patient come in who was who had a knee injury, and there were some lawyers involved in things like this, and I was convinced that this guy had a bona fide injury. And I'm examining him, and he's making the right noises at the right time, and he seems really sincere. And then as he was leaving the building, I just happened to look out between my blinds, and I watched him throw his crutches over his shoulder, walk to the car, throw them in the trunk of his car, and drive away. And so, yeah, you can be fooled, and you don't always know what the other person's agenda is. So, medicine is always going to be both an art and a science, and that's what makes it challenging and rewarding.
Well, the art and the science part sounds like you kind of continue to move into the science as well after you got your medical education.
Yeah, when I was in, because my background had been in microbiology, I always figured, maybe I'll do, infectious diseases or something like that. But when I was in medical school, I got involved in doing triathlons. There were a couple of guys, one guy who was a former pro cyclist and then a pro triathlete, another guy who was a pro cyclist, and they kind of got me into it. and one of my list of things to do after my cancer scare, was like, because you make that bucket list, right? One of them was to do a triathlon. I'd been a lifeguard and stuff. I'd grown up on the summers on the beach in New Jersey, so I thought this would be something I needed to do. And so they kind of started helping me train, and I was terrible. I mean, really awful. I mean, I'm 6'4". On a good day, I weighed 250. I really wasn't meant to do things like run marathons. So as we're going through this process, and they're slaughtering me on these bike rides and things, I'm thinking there's got to be an easier way to do this. And one of my professors, Bill Sexton, was like, Skiba, you like math and stuff here, and started throwing, papers at me that had to do with the kind of mathematical aspects of how you properly train somebody, because there's people who've done that work. And I looked at it and I was like, oh yeah, this is something I can do. I built up this working model of it, and my first experiment was on myself, and I knocked about 10 minutes off my 5K time in about 6 months. And so I'm like, which still didn't make me fast. I was still abysmally slow, but I was way faster than I used to be. And so I'm just thinking that this is something I could do, because then my friends are saying to me, hey, can you help me like this? So I started helping some of my friends, and they started winning things, and they got very excited. And so I filed for a patent on that, and I continued kind of developing this and training athletes. And then I had an athlete win a world championship and set a world record, and then my career was kind of snowballed. So I ended up realizing at that point that the kind of science that needed to be done to continue this work, there weren't many people doing it. So I just kind of made a career decision that that's what I was going to do. So I did my fellowship in sports medicine, and after working a couple of years, I moved to the UK. I went to work at the University of Exeter, where I ran their sports medicine program, and did my PhD developing some new mathematical models of fatigue that really allow you to predict when, say, during a race or during a workout, someone's going to become exhausted, and how to strategize to make sure that doesn't happen at an inopportune time. And while I was doing all that, I was also, developing some of these tools for the British Olympic movement, because the 2012 games were coming. So it was some element of serendipity, and some element of it was really just being in the right place at the right time, and being the right guy to answer the question. So yeah, it was no one's more surprised than me that things have turned out the way they have, to be honest.
Wow, wow. So how does something as seemingly complex as endurance performance, right? How does math come into play in that, and and the other factors that you're calculating?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look across the animal kingdom, all critters exhibit this kind of behavior, from things like lungless salamanders and frogs to things like horses, up to humans, dogs. All these creatures that have been studied have the same thing. And what they show is that as you go longer, you get slower necessarily. And it's not a straight line, it's a curve. So going from, say, a 400-meter run or a 100-meter run to a mile, you go way slower. And then that curve kind of levels out. So your 5K pace isn't much faster than your 10K pace. And your 10K pace isn't that much slower than your half marathon pace, and so on. This is called the critical power curve, or the power duration curve. And it has a basic biochemistry to it that is conserved across the animal kingdom. And for me, that's what makes it kind of so interesting. It's very nice that I can use this to help athletes train better. But it's a fundamental aspect of animal life and animal energetics. And so for that reason, I think it's worth studying, because it seems to be a rule.
So somebody comes to you and says, "I want to get faster." How do you start pursuing that?
Well, the first question is, how fast are you now, right? And so we can do that by either, say, looking at their race results, or going out and testing them a little bit, and kind of seeing what they have under the hood. So, if I'm dealing with a runner, I might send them out and have them run a 5K race, or a 10K race, and a shorter race, maybe a mile or something. And I can make one of these curves. And then I can take that curve and put it up against other known good athletes whose results we have, and see, is your goal reasonable? Like I once used some slightly different models to figure out how hard it would be how hard or how much training would I have to do to catch Lance Armstrong going up the Alpe d'Huez. And the answer was about 95 hours of training a week, which is quite obviously impossible, right? So, and that's part of the challenge of using these models is that, you have to use them within certain bounds, otherwise they give you ridiculous information. Um, but once I have this model, I can then start advising them. Like one really easy thing to do, or one common way patients come into my office, is they end up saying, "Hey, I can't keep up with people at swim practice anymore." When they're 14, 15 years old. And so what I do is I ask them to give me their training paces in the pool, and I have them swim some test efforts so I can make one of these curves. And then I see, are these paces you're trying to swim, do they fall above this curve, which indicates you're not physiologically capable of doing it? Or do they fall below this curve, in which case there's something else going on, and we need to figure out what that something else is. Do you have a problem with your lungs or your heart, or something else? And so it's an interesting way of approaching it, because sometimes it's as simple as, yeah, you're not physiologically capable of swimming this pace for 300 yet, but you can swim it for 100. So let's alter your training program so that you start swimming this pace for 100s for a while, and then we'll change it up so that you try to swim it for 200s for a while, and so on. So we're going to try to build you up to where these other people are. And so it's nice because it kind of, if you just follow the data, it kind of tells you what you need to do. Yeah, you're not that fast yet, but you're that fast for this period of time. So let's start there and stretch it out. And it's really not more complicated than that.
No?
It's funny. Like I said, I was never a great athlete. I played some volleyball in college, and that was about it. But if you study exercise physiology, there are some golden rules, that seem to be very conserved. And if you follow those rules, you end up getting particular results. And I think part of the challenge is that there's a lot of sort of guruism, right, in sports training. I'm the coach. I know the secrets. So you should pay me a gajillion dollars to make your team win the Super Bowl or whatever. And certainly in terms of strategy and things like that, that's a different story. But when you're talking about, functionally training a human to be better at performing in a certain way, that's actually not that complicated an enterprise. And I tell people, within a couple of years of starting out working as a coach, kind of in the elite field, I mean, my athletes were regularly winning world championships. I was already advising Olympians. I mean, I was hired by Nike to work on Breaking Two to make, guys like Eliud Kipchoge run faster. And it's just, once you have mastered this body of knowledge, it becomes relatively easy to advise people in an appropriate way.
That's amazing. Yeah, I am curious about the kind of how insights you might run up against people who have other coaches, or you talk about the swim team or these other groups. But so how does that, do you get a variety of responses, or just any help we can get is great, or something else?
Yeah, it depends on who you're working with. For example, when we went to work on Breaking Two, and I was traveling to Africa and meeting these really talented coaches who were coaching guys that were, already getting world records and things in the marathon, they couldn't get enough information from us. They were like, they were really interested. What can you do to help us? Tell us more, which was fascinating to me because my experience in the Western world, very often coaches are kind of standoffish or a little bit, I don't want to say adversarial, but even a little bit adversarial, because they view your kind of knowledge as some sort of threat to their kind of rule over their team. And my thing was always, hey, I'm a coach too, and my goal is not to replace you. I view you as a carpenter, and I want to give you better tools, and that's it. And some people are really amenable to that, and some people want nothing to do with it. And part of that is the element of accountability. See, if you start measuring how athletes are training every day, and you start measuring how they're performing every day, and the athlete is doing what you're telling them to do, but they aren't getting any better, then that's your problem as the coach. It's not the athlete's fault. Um, Whereas if you don't measure those things, then you always have the opportunity as a coach to say, oh, the athlete wasn't, executing my workouts properly, or the athlete wasn't doing this or wasn't doing that. And there is a population of people that don't want that element of accountability. They don't want someone able to look over their shoulder and say, hey, wait a minute, the emperor has no clothes here, kind of thing. And that's been interesting just to find this kind of breadth of personalities, across the profession.
I can imagine that some people would say, this isn't Moneyball, this is track or this is triathlons or whatever. You can't just plug in a bunch of numbers and get and spit out a better athlete guaranteed. You've got to worry about the nutrition. You've got to worry about whether they're getting enough recovery. You got to do all this and all that. And
But you can
so,
put
yeah.
numbers to those things, right? So,
Mhm.
like, we know that, for example, a human can process between 1 and 2 grams of carbohydrate per minute exercised, right? And by doing that, we're going to lengthen their time to fatigue. We're going to make them faster, and we're going to give them a better chance of doing well. So even things like nutrition, there are numbers there that we can rely on to say there's a better way of doing this. Now, is there an art to it? Absolutely. For example, certain people don't tolerate certain kinds of carbohydrates. I used to coach Joanna Zeiger, who was already an Olympian for the 2000 games in Sydney in triathlon. She had finished fourth when she came to me, and she was like, I've had a lot of injuries. I'm not doing well. I think you might be the guy that can help me. And so I made a number of changes to her training and stuff. But one of the most important things we figured out is that she was intolerant to fructose. And fructose intolerance is almost as common as lactose intolerance in the population, only we don't talk about it. And so, because there's fructose in literally everything, right? Everything has high fructose corn syrup in it. I mean, English muffins have high fructose corn syrup in it. Why is that? um, but that's the way it is. And so what we did was we said, okay, this is part of your problem. So we mixed her up a custom beverage. We went to a brewery supply place. We brought maltodextrin, which is a glucose polymer, um, and we mixed that up with some flavoring. And we had her drink that, and so she'd get enough calories in, and it wouldn't upset her stomach. And lo and behold, we completely turned around her triathlon career. In the 2008 season, she won or got on the podium in almost every race she entered. And then at the World Championships, she won and also set a world record. Again, you had to know that fructose isn't everything. Fructose intolerance is a problem. And there's a way to mix something up that's not going to cause that kind of GI upset. And again, so part of that was, the art of, okay, I'm going to cook something up in my kitchen for this athlete. But part of it was just having that background knowledge, having read enough to know that, yeah, fructose intolerance is a problem. And that's probably what her problem is. We ought to figure that out. I mean, one of the other things Dr. Gutenson said to me a million years ago was, if you talk to the patient long enough, they will tell you what's wrong with them. And it wasn't actually her that told me; it was her father. We were chit chatting at a race, and he told me about how when she was little, she would have a glass of orange juice and have terrible GI problems. And that's when the penny dropped for me. What's okay? So there's something going on here. I started thinking about that, and that's what led me down that fructose path.
Wow, wow. So it sounds like, I mean, all the struggle here is to make people, get the most out of their bodies and do the most that they can, and that's going to be unique for everybody. Is that?
Yeah, yeah. Early on in my career, the kind of my sort of tagline has always been that the secret is there is no secret. And so relatively early in my career, I wrote 2 books that basically I just told everyone how I did things. Like they were both about 150 pages or something. It wasn't a lot. I was like, this is what you need to know to do better. And again, both of those sold really, really well. And that's just it. Like, I try to take all this stuff that I've gathered and put it in a really digestible, conversationally, written thing that anyone can understand. This is all you got to do. Just be willing to be honest with yourself. Be willing to measure what you do. Be willing to measure how you do. And then these are all the potential interventions you could try. Which makes sense. Which of these things makes sense given your situation? You know, this is how much you should be eating. Are you eating that much? And so on. And the kind of it's been very gratifying over the years because it's a lot of fun when you get to go to the Monza racetrack with Eliud Kipchoge and watch him try to run the marathon in 2 hours. Like that's I mean that's pretty cool. Not a lot of people get to do that kind of thing. But for me, it's like maybe even more gratifying sometimes when someone is like, hey, I followed what you said, and I placed in my age group in my local 5K or something, you know, because at the end of the day, I'm a doctor. I want people to be healthy, and if I can do things that make you enjoy exercise more and keep you healthier, um, then I have made a way bigger impact than I could just make in my office all by myself. because now I have a reach to people who never would have known my name.
Yeah. So how do you look at you're working in Africa with people who are going to break 2 hours in the marathon, which I can't even, the concept of trying to keep that pace for like 200 meters blows me away, right? Uh,
I
um,
tried at the race at the kind of the red dirt track they train on in Eldoret. A bunch of us tried to sort of run with them, and we lasted like 50 yards. and, and I was laying on the infield of the track among these like cow pies and stuff, just positive I was about to die because we were also at altitude, and just I thought my heart was going to like explode out of my chest like an alien. It was terrible.
oh man. Yeah, yeah. I mean, these top athletes, it's just another, it's just a level beyond anything I can imagine, and so you can work with those people, and then you're also getting satisfaction out of being the sports medicine director at a Chicago area hospital.
Look,
Like, is that
it's I mean it's all look, it's all the same thing. We all have the same basic plumbing. If I mean, Greg LeMond back in the day had a great quote. He said, "It doesn't get any easier; you just get faster." Um, and that's the truth, because when you look physiologically speaking, Eliud Kipchoge and a well-trained endurance runner, right, are running a 10K at roughly the same percentage of their max. It's just that Eliud is way faster when he's doing it, but both people are hurting just as bad because their physiology is suffering the same insult, relatively speaking. And that's kind of the trick of training, is realizing that you need to work relative to your own physiological thresholds. Where is your maximum oxygen uptake? Where do you start to produce lactate? Where does your physiology become unstable? And when you train relative to that, rather than to someone else's numbers, you start getting a lot better, a lot faster. Because if you just start, trying to go out and put in the kind of, heroic mileage that like an Eliud Kipchoge or Paul Radcliffe do, that's going to injure you and kill me, right? But if I train relative to my own limits, you know, percentage wise, I may achieve very similar improvements, even if it's not the same in absolute terms.
are there things that people, the equivalent of weekend warriors can do without labs and access to equipment that and experts that
Absolutely.
can help out?
Absolutely. The most important thing is what I already told you about, where you do a few different length races and you plot one of these curves. Because what that curve tells you, when you figure out where that curve levels out, if you're running, it's called the critical speed. If you're riding a bike or something with a power meter, it's called the critical power. But that turns out to be a dividing line between what's termed stable physiology and unstable physiology. It's around 10K pace. So if you stay slower than that, and I watch you in my laboratory, what I find is that your oxygen use stays very stable. Your lactate production stays very stable. Your body can maintain that level of exercise for a considerable length of time. But if we go just a little bit faster and we cross that critical threshold, what happens is that everything goes off the rails. Slowly, your oxygen use rises, despite the fact that you're not running any faster. Lactate in your blood rises, despite the fact that you're not running any faster. And if you look inside the muscle, you can see a variety of things associated with fatigue, also trending towards maximum or minimum values. And eventually, all these things hit some limit and you're forced to quit. But you can find out where this threshold exists with nothing more complicated than a stopwatch. And that's the beautiful part about it. And that's kind of what I get into in the book, is that you don't have to come to the lab and spend a bunch of money to work with me. Like, you can go to the track, you can take your stopwatch with you, you can, get a power meter for your bicycle, and you can figure this out all by yourself. Like, there's no mystery here. There's no secret to this.
Well, that's really cool. I feel like it would be missing a chance to ask you a little bit more about the Breaking Two, which was, I guess that was a Nike project designed to help the best marathoner in the world get under 2 hours in a marathon. And
Yeah.
so what kind of things did you do? Because this guy's already running 2:03 or 2:04 or something, and that's incredibly fast. So how do you take an elite guy and get that extra percent off or whatever the number is.
These guys are super fast. One of the easiest things to intervene with early on was in terms of nutrition. Um, and a few of us had this. So, Zersane Tedesse, who at the time was the world record holder in the half marathon, he and I are having dinner, and we're chatting a bit. He's such a nice guy, such a genuinely nice guy. And I'm asking him, I'm like, Zersane, when you're running, what are you drinking? You know, and he looks at me for a second. He goes, I don't understand the question. I said, Zersane, when you're running, like, what's in your bottle? What do you drink? I thought maybe we were having like a language barrier issue. And he says, Doctor, when I am running, I am not drinking, I am running. And and we're kind of looking at each other. And I said, you're telling me you tried to run the marathon without taking a sip of water? He goes, basically, yes. And all of a sudden it makes sense why this guy can run, under 60 minutes for a half marathon, but never ran faster than about 2:12 or 2:13 for a marathon, right? Because, if you drop your hydration by more than about 2% body weight, you begin to suffer significant performance decrements. And so, like, one of the most important things we did in that effort was get Zersane Tedesse to start drinking more and to put some carbohydrate and a little bit of caffeine in there. And all of a sudden, he goes from like a 212 guy to like a 206 guy or something, um, which is a big deal. So that was the kind of thing, was looking at, people assume because you're the fastest guy in the world that you got this figured out. Oftentimes, I find that elite athletes that they're succeeding in spite of their training and nutrition, not because of it. And that you can find little places to intervene and take guys who are even really fast and make them even faster. And that's kind of what we were able to do, which is just a profoundly cool experience, to feel like you had something to offer those guys.
Is that the cap? Like, people talk about there being a cap on the marathon time, a limit. What do you think?
My friend Mike Joyner, who's up at the Mayo Clinic, he wrote a very simple equation, more than 20 years ago now. That's how Breaking Two got started, where he said that given human physiology, if you put all these numbers together in terms of what's the maximum oxygen uptake we can theoretically see, what's the lactate threshold, what's the exercise economy we can see, he came up with a number that was like 157 and change. And that's probably pretty close to what's possible. And it'll probably take 100 years to get there or something. Because the thing is, all these things tend to be balanced, right? So, for example, Andy Jones, my friend and former PhD advisor, he has, the 80-80-180 rule, which is that, you have to have roughly a VO2 max of 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Your lactate threshold, meaning the point where you start making lactate, has to be around 80% of that 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen use. And your running economy has to be about 180 milliliters per kilogram per kilometer. And so you can horse trade, because if you've got a very high VO2 max, like let's say you have a VO2 max of 85, it's kind of like a Ferrari. You don't get very good gas mileage, right? So your economy might be lower. So you can trade the slightly lower economy for the slightly higher VO2 max, or vice versa. If someone's very economical, they don't need to have as big an engine to go that fast. So what you're really doing is, and that was the beginning of Breaking Two, was in Exeter, in the lab in the UK, we were testing, dozens and dozens of Nike's athletes, to see who had roughly the plumbing that would make this possible if we helped them, train the right way. And so again, there's this element of, there are numbers that we can put to this. It's you do a little bit of screening, and then you try to see what you can manipulate. And part of that was the shoes. We were able to improve exercise economy by giving them a shoe that returned more energy.
Take me inside your head as the actual trial is happening. Is that a sustained level of excitement and terror for 2 hours, or what's going on?
I was terrified from the beginning. I had been working for Nike, and they weren't telling me a whole lot about what we were doing until, one day they're like, hey, this is the project. And I'm kind of like, you want me to do what? And it's not just the idea of working with these super, super duper athletes. It's the idea that I'm a doctor and I know all the horrible diseases that can kill me in Africa. So when they bring me to Portland, to Oregon, I go up to Beaverton. I'm at the place, and I'm talking to Eliud Kipchoge, And he says, Doctor, he says, you're going to come to Africa and we're going to train together. And then we kind of look at each other and I start laughing. He goes, well, he goes, maybe you will ride in the car and I will train. And I said, Elliot, I said, I'm a doctor. I spent my whole career learning what's going to kill me in Africa. I'm not going to Africa, you know? And the Nike guys were like, hey, Skiba, check your contract. You're going to Africa. You better go get your shots. So 2 weeks later, I'm on this plane to Africa, you know? I'm thinking, this is totally insane. And, you know, as we're flying over the Rift Valley, you know, of Kenya, which is gorgeous, but there's, you know, terrible turbulence. And we're in this little puddle jumper. Um, you know, I've never been a great flyer to begin with. And so this nice Kenyan lady is sitting next to me. And she goes, you look afraid. I said, yeah, I'm afraid. She goes, would you like me to teach you the Hail Mary in Swahili? I said, that sounds great. Thank you. You know, so right from the beginning, this was terror. But once I got to Africa, it was an incredible experience. I would go back tomorrow if I could. And that's been the real tragedy. This for me, a personal tragedy of this pandemic for me is that, you know, I was hoping to get back much sooner. But once we started working and we saw how genuinely interested everyone was in this project, you know, people on the outside often looked at it as though it was some kind of stunt. For those of us on the inside, this was a really kind of exciting and important, you know, enterprise. And all the guys in Africa were just as excited. And that wore away my fear relatively quickly. And their kind of enthusiasm was infectious. So yeah, it turned out to be initially kind of, you know, butt clenching terror, but very quickly it turned into just excitement. I think all of us, you know, kind of when the project, you know, wrapped up at the end, you know, all of us were very sad to see it end, because it was such a cool experience.
Wow. Well, hopefully you'll get a chance to do something like it again.
Oh, there's always more stuff coming down the pike, but yeah, yeah, I would do it again tomorrow if I could.
Thanks, Phil. We'll have to break here and we'll come back in the next episode. And that's when we'll have a chance to talk about your experiences at the COVID front lines and working with athletes who have long COVID. But thanks for sharing all your experience and thoughts with us today in this first episode. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this episode. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any episodes, including that next conversation with Phil, which I promise is really, really gripping. So we'll see you next time. Thanks. I'm Chris Gorski.